In the Old West, some towns were dangerous because of who passed through. Others were dangerous because of where they sat. And a few were dangerous because death simply became part of daily business. Men were shot over money, cards, women, insults, and sometimes nothing at all. These weren't places where violence surprised anyone. It was expected. These are the deadliest towns of the Old West. Dodge City. Dodge City earned its reputation the hard way, but it also learned how to contain it. In the 1870s, Dodge sat at the end of the Chisholm Trail, where hundreds of cowboys arrived flush with cash and looking to unload months of trail life in saloons, brothels, and gambling halls. Violence flared most often along Front Street, where alcohol, firearms, and crowded rooms made fights escalate fast. Shootings, stabbings, and fistfights were common during peak cattle season. But Dodge City refused to let chaos define it. Lawmen like Tom Bear River Smith, Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, and Ed and Bat Masterson enforced gun ordinances aggressively, often with lethal consequences. Killings still happened, but thanks to these legendary lawmen, they were increasingly controlled, rather than constant. Dodge City remained dangerous, especially when the herds were in, but its reputation grew larger than its death toll. People arrived expecting violence. The town worked to make sure it didn't happen. El Paso. El Paso, Texas, was an Old West killing ground, with lawmen and outlaws dying there in rapid succession. In 1881, Dallas Stoudenmire became the 6th marshal appointed in 8 months, and, within days, killed 4 men during the 4 dead in 5 seconds shootout. His tenure brought temporary order through gunfire, but it was brief. He was killed a few months later. El Paso also became the final stop for legendary gunslinger John Wesley Hardin, who was shot and killed inside the Acme Saloon in 1895 by John Selman. Killings like these weren't rare. They happened in saloons, streets, and in broad daylight, in full view of the town. El Paso didn't just flirt with violence. It cycled through it repeatedly until even its most dangerous men ran out of luck. Canyon Diablo. Canyon Diablo appeared almost overnight in 1880, a temporary railroad town built beside a deep gorge east of Flagstaff, while crews worked to span the canyon with a bridge. Nearly 2,000 people flooded in just as fast. Their main road, Hell Street, ran around the clock, packed with saloons, brothels, and gambling dens that never closed. Violence followed immediately. The town's first peace marshal was sworn in at 3 in the afternoon and shot dead before 8 that same night. Others didn't last much longer. One of the most notorious incidents occurred late in the town's history, on April 8, 1905. 2 lawmen caught up with bandits William Evans and John Shaw in Canyon Diablo after a saloon robbery in nearby Winslow. Evans, Shaw, and one of the lawmen fired 21 shots in a matter of seconds, leaving Shaw dead and Evans wounded and captured. What made Canyon Diablo different wasn't just how violent it was, but how little time it had to become anything else. Once the bridge was finished and the railroad crews moved on, the population collapsed. The killings only stopped not because order arrived, but because the town no longer existed. Deadwood. Deadwood was formed in 1876 after gold was discovered in the Black Hills, packing gamblers, miners, and armed drifters into an overcrowded gulch where money changed hands faster than restraint. Violence centered on gambling halls and saloons, where disputes over cards, claims, and debts turned lethal. That August, legendary gunslinger Wild Bill Hickok was shot in the back of the head while playing poker at a local saloon, killed at close range in a crowded room. The murder barely slowed the town. Killings continued as drunken arguments escalated into gunfire, and knives came out over money and grudges. Justice was uneven and often improvised, with mining courts and vigilantes stepping in when tempers boiled over. In Deadwood, men didn't square off for history. They were shot where they stood, and the town barely paused. Tombstone. At its peak in the early 1880s, Tombstone, Arizona recorded hundreds of deaths from a mix of gunfights, stabbings, lynchings, mining accidents, train mishaps, and disease. Its reputation for constant violence was amplified in October 1881 by the OK Corral gunfight, a highly publicized confrontation between Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, Doc Holliday, and armed members of the Cowboys gang that left 3 men dead in under a minute. A short time later, lawman Virgil Earp was ambushed and permanently crippled, while his brother Morgan was assassinated. These weren't random acts, but part of an ongoing cycle of retaliation tied to gambling, politics, and the gangs operating throughout Cochise County. Beyond the famous names, Tombstone recorded dozens of violent deaths between 1879 and 1884. What made the town feared was not one shootout, but the overlap of money, armed factions, and weak law institutions that made lethal outcomes common, even for people trying to stay out of trouble. Virginia City. In 1859, miners struck the Comstock Lode in Virginia City, Nevada, the richest silver deposit ever found in the United States. And within a few years, a rough mining camp turned into a crowded city hanging off the side of a Nevada mountain. The money came fast, and so did the violence. Mining claims were worth fortunes, and disputes over them regularly ended with gunfire instead of paperwork. Vigilante committees filled the gaps in between law and order, carrying out public hangings. One of the most infamous killings was that of Julia Boulette, whose 1867 murder shocked the city and drew national attention to how little protection even well-known residents had. Saloons and gambling halls produced a steady stream of shootings and stabbings, while political rivalries over mine ownership spilled into street violence. American literary icon Mark Twain, the editor of the local newspaper in the early 1860s, wrote openly about the casual presence of death and the speed with which killings faded into background noise. What sets Virginia City apart isn't one famous gunfight. It's that this level of violence persisted for years, long enough to shape the city's lasting identity. This wasn't chaos that flared and vanished. It was continuous and deadly. Bodie. In its heyday, Bodie, California, was described as a lawless sea of sin. Between 1878 and 1882, a town of only a few thousand recorded roughly 30 murders and more than 70 shooting incidents, many occurring directly on Main Street. Gambling, alcohol, and mining claims fueled confrontations that regularly escalated into gunfire. Killers like William Bummer Dan Collins and Tom Riley were often labeled bad men from Bodie, a term that carried the reputation of a town so violent that the label itself served as a warning. When formal law failed, which was often, vigilante action filled the gap, most notably in 1881 when Joseph DeRoche was hanged for murder. Even among the roughest towns, Bodie stood out because violence was not episodic or tied to a single feud. It was embedded in daily life, shaping how order was enforced and how survival was negotiated. Pioche. From roughly 1870 to 1874, Pioche, Nevada generated a level of death that dwarfed most Western mining camps. Contemporary newspapers estimated that well over 60% of Nevada's homicides during that period occurred in Pioche. Before the town recorded a single natural death, more than 70 men were already buried on Boot Hill. Michael Casey murdered Thomas Gosson over a money dispute, which led gunfighter Jim Levy to gun Casey down in a public duel, only for Levy to be shot in the face moments later by iconic Old West lawman David Neagle. In 1872, courtesan Fanny Peterson was murdered in the street by her lover in broad daylight. A year later, a constable rough-handling a dog triggered a chain of insults that escalated into a gunfight, wounding 5 men and killing John H. Lynch. Known killers like Morgan Courtney moved openly through town, until they were eventually cut down themselves. In Pioche, violence didn't require legend or buildup. It happened fast and often in full view of everyone else. The silver ran out, the guns went quiet, and Pioche was left with nothing but its dead.